So my name's Janice Lord. I'm an associate professor in the botany department. I've been there more than 25 years. I did my PhD at the University of Canterbury, where I was interested in grasslands and also the impact of grazing on grasslands and biodiversity. Full disclosure, I like native plants, but I also like lattes, and I'm having roast hogget for Christmas. So I'm very deeply invested in this juxtaposition, or this finding the spot where we can be environmentally and biodiversity positive and be fabulous at producing all of these wonderful primary products and reaching our export markets and communicating those positive stories to our markets. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a smorgasbord of research that's happening in the botany department that basically is around these themes of carbon, natives and biodiversity. So I will be scooting through a number of projects and highlighting postgraduate research particularly, but hopefully sort of come full circle and bring it all together and comment also on biodiversity credit schemes and where they might fit in the overall picture. So Angus, thank you very much for setting the stage in terms of carbon forestry. And so this sort of information is not new to any of you, but in the current environment with the ETS, carbon sequestration is basically reduced to woody species that conform to the ETS definition of forests. And in the current economic climate, as Angus very nicely stated, there has been a lot of interest in planting fast-growing exotics simply because of the short-term return that you get for that initial high carbon sequestration. And this is a graph that's slightly different to Angus's graph, but this is from Tane's Tree Trust as well, where you can see that sequestration rates for radiata pine over the short term are very rapid. And for other native species, so native species such as kauri and totara and broadleaves, slower on the outset, but there's certainly, there's currently not a lot of data for long-term planted native trees, but as the data starts to come in, the picture is changing, as Angus said, that there is potential for much more long-term carbon sequestration for natives compared to short-term sequestration for Pinus radiata. And the big reason is that native trees live longer. Something that grows fast ecologically, there's a trade-off between growth rate and longevity that sort of applies across most organisms. If it's fast growing, it's going to be rapid to mature and it's not going to live very long. And so when we look at some of the, there were a couple of discussion documents that were put out earlier this year about changes to the ETS around the permanent forest category. And one of the suggestions there was that the permanent forest category should be perhaps targeted more at native trees than exotic trees because of that. What happens when the forest reaches maturity and it no longer is sequestering carbon. And in the ETS definition of permanent forest, that was not harvested for at least 50 years. But the important point that these forests will cease earning units when the forest reaches maturity. So it's no longer incrementally sequestering carbon where growth equals decay. And this bottom graph here is just something I put together from the basic literature showing the longevity of some of the different tree species that have been planted in some areas, but also are known to be timber trees or long-lived native trees. And you can see compared to radiata longevity, native trees have a much greater potential for long-lived carbon storage. Now, obviously, that doesn't pay the bills in the first 20 years, though, and that's the big problem. The multi-generational aspect of carbon storage for native forests, as Angus nicely pointed out, is also something that needs to be considered, but economically doesn't necessarily pay for itself. So one thing we've been looking at, and I've had a student looking at this as a part of a postgraduate research project, is this idea of hybrid or transitional forests. This is something that, again, was mentioned in the proposed changes to the ETS permanent forest categories. It's an idea that's been around for a few years, and Adam Forbes has been a really good proponent of this. But one of the big questions was, would it work down here where it's cold and dry. It's fine if it works in some nice, warm, wet place up in the Waikato, but would it work down here? So what Amy Pritchard, my master's student, has been looking at is surveying biodiversity under a range of exotic canopies, coastal Otago, so she hasn't gone into central Otago. And it's been surprising. I was expecting, high diversity in all the native stuff and nothing in all the exotic stuff. I was proven wrong. It comes down to the fact of light penetration and the nature of management in the forest. So dense, young radiata that hasn't been thinned, hasn't been pruned, nothing grows under it. It's too dark, there's too many needles. The needles change the chemical composition of the soil. However, this middle photograph here, poplar, we've found extensive native tree seedlings naturally establishing under poplar, diverse native understory under old Douglas fir. So this was large Douglas fir, quite open, lots of light penetrating. So, and these are mean native species richness under different types of canopies. The yellow ones are exotic canopy, the green ones are native canopy, and you can see under some conditions this could actually work. But the key thing is that it has to be managed, it has to be adjacent to a native seed source. But if we can get this working, it means you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have your fast-growing exotics to start off with, and in the right conditions and the right management with seed source, or if you're introducing seeds, you could conceivably transition it to a native forest. So that's the first bit of research I wanted to show you. One of the other things we've been looking a lot at is below ground. And I know Frank particularly wanted me to talk about soil, which I will, Frank. So we do a lot of work in the botany department on mycorrhizal fungi. And if you're not familiar, it's something that's becoming a lot more prevalent in people's thinking. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that form usually beneficial associations with plant roots. Most plants are mycorrhizal to some extent. In New Zealand, our native podocarps, kauri, most native trees and shrubs, backtrack. There are two most common types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's the ones we call arbuscular mycorrhizal or AMF. They get inside the plant root. And then there's the ones we call ectomycorrhizae that form a sheath on the outside of the plant root. The benefit to the plant and the fungus is the same, and that the fungus hyphae are much more effective at scavenging phosphorus and nitrogen, feed it back to the plant roots, and the plant roots exude sugars and carbohydrates that the fungi take advantage of. So it is mutually beneficial and incredibly important for species that form mycorrhizal associations. It really affects growth rate and also resilience, drought tolerance, and things like that. So pine trees, spruces, eucalypt are all ectomycorrhizal. So are our native beeches. This lovely little Venn diagram, which came out of student work from the botany department, was some of the first evidence that indicated that native beeches could use mycorrhizae from pine. So could Carnica. And Carnica and Manuka are really important in this story in that they can use both ectomycorrhizal fungi and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Now, podocarps, kauri, all of the other broadleaf natives are arbuscular mycorrhizal, not ectomycorrhizal, so they do not benefit from the mycorrhizae under pine. And in fact, it could be quite detrimental to them. Douglas fir, interestingly, is arbuscular mycorrhizal. So, looking at that result of Amy's, that might have something to do with why she found so many native plant species under the Douglas fir. Other work we've done, we've found quite surprisingly good success putting Manuka and beech into areas where there've been old pine shelters because they seem to perhaps benefit from that soil. So that's some other work that we're doing. The type of mycorrhizal fungi matters, and I will make a big plug to, please don't go, oh my goodness, mycorrhizae is great, go onto Amazon and buy God knows what. And I have had people email me saying, I've been sent this, someone asked me to try this, is it any good? A lot of these products are agricultural mycorrhizae that might not make any difference to your tree plantings, your riparian plantings. Some of them appear to contain unwanted organisms, which is a problem. There are a few companies now, though, who are starting to look into, can we produce a mycorrhizal product that could be of use to native plants? And so there is some opportunity there. How you can do it will depend on the type of mycorrhizae. These arbuscular mycorrhizae, you could create a product that could be dried and sold. Ectomycorrhizae, these are the ones that form mushrooms. We've done some work that you can preserve the spore, but they can't be cultured generally. So they're a more difficult one to work on, but we're doing some research looking at whether you can make pellets from existing native soils and use those to inoculate things. This is work from a master's student. It was a lockdown experiment where she accidentally forgot to water her plants, but produced a really interesting result. So these different bars here, she was growing Manuka seedlings and beech seedlings in either beech soil or Manuka soil, whether it had been sterilized or not. So where it says B-, that means it was beech soil, but it had been sterilized. M- is Manuka soil that had been sterilized. B or M+ meant it was live, full of mycorrhizae. And the big outcome was Manuka, which is actually quite drought sensitive, only survived where it was in pots with live Manuka mycorrhizae. When it was in the treatments with the sterilized Manuka soil, there was significantly more death. So that was a really interesting result, that the mycorrhizae affected the survival of the Manuka. And she also had a correlation with growth rates and infection too. Right, some other things that we've been doing is looking at how we can apply agricultural methods to establish native plants at scale. So we have worked with a number of companies and a number of different seed drills, putting native tree seeds through agricultural seed drills. I really like big tractors. That's been great. We have found, though, really cost-wise, it isn't necessarily any cheaper than planting, because you've still got to do extensive site preparation, there's ongoing maintenance and weed control. And when you're using big machinery to sow seeds, the sites need to be accessible, and that's not necessarily where you might want to put an area of native trees, because that's often your better accessible paddocks for other uses. Our best success in these trials has been where it's been a rough surface. So lots of hummocks and hollows and shelter, bit of bracken doesn't hurt. And I'm trying to get a farmer I work with to plant bracken, which is a novel concept to a lot of people. But unfortunately, what we've also found is something to be aware of. There's growing evidence that repeated use of herbicide like glyphosate is going to reduce the effectiveness of the mycorrhizae in the soil, which could come back and bite you further on if your plants don't thrive because you've gone and changed the fungal composition of the soil. The other problem is that forage brassicas, the whole of the brassica family, does not host mycorrhizae. So if you're trying to convert an area which has had forest brassicas into a riparian area or a carbon forestry area, particularly with natives, you're going to run into trouble because you won't have that fungal component in the soil. So something we've been telling people and working on more is that when you're thinking about above ground and changing land use or introducing some new economic opportunities, you've got to think about below ground as well. Right. We've also been working with Doc and Invico Tech, who fly drones, and Ahika Consulting here in Dunedin, looking at drone seeding of seed pods. And this, I think, is a very exciting opportunity to get a range of desirable, valuable species into relatively inaccessible areas. You know, think of East Cape Tairāwhiti and all of the landslips and things like that. Obviously, they can deliver seed pods very precisely over large areas and into difficult terrain. We can put the appropriate mycorrhizae into the seed pods. We can adjust the seed mix. The downsides that we've been finding with experimental trials is you do need a lot of seeds, and the availability of native seeds is it still needs to upscale to meet demand. It doesn't suit all species. Some species, the seeds get crushed in the process of making the pods. So we're working on that. And of course, the seedlings are still vulnerable to weeds and herbivores. But that, in terms of kickstarting some native regeneration in the back blocks of your farm could be a better way to go than planting or trying to seed in other ways. Right. And just sort of the last comment about native forests, don't underestimate the value of native afforestation with natural regeneration. We've been watching very closely changes that are happening in Mahu Whenua and Motutapu Station up between Wanaka and Arrowtown, where Manukau has been spreading after that area was destocked following entry following registration as a QE2 covenant. And the beach has naturally been colonising into the Manukau. We're measuring whether we are going through the process of seeing how that can be then registered as ETS eligible. So getting on to non-forest carbon, I want to emphasise that when we're talking about carbon sequestration, as Angus mentioned, it's not just what's happening above ground, it's happening below ground. And certainly for temperate forests, much of the carbon that's stored is actually below ground, not above ground. And we look at some New Zealand types of ecosystems, and wetlands and tussock grasslands, and even in pastures, most of the carbon is below ground. And this value here, about 500 tonnes per metre deep of peatland, that's a global value that's been measured in peatlands globally. The deepest peatlands in New Zealand are 14 metres deep, that's up in the Hauraki, so that's a lot of carbon. The value of that kind of below ground carbon storage is it can't easily, well, peatlands can burn, but they're less fire vulnerable. So in terms of predicting an investment, I've been told to hurry up. This is a modelling done in California where under current climate change scenarios, it's actually safer to invest in grasslands for carbon storage rather than forest because the forest burns. So sort of coming back to biodiversity, I hope a lot of you saw the ideas, the discussion document that was released early in the year about a biodiversity credit scheme. This is the idea that verified projects could sell credits and buyers could finance or claim recognition for investing in those. For something like that to work, there needs to be confidence that the credits have integrity. So there needs to be streamlined verification reporting mechanisms that are not overly onerous on the project or the owner of the project that's trying to claim the credits. So I'm part of a multidisciplinary group where we're looking at biodiversity credits from the point of view of not just the ecology, but also sustainable management and economics. And we're using a couple of local case studies, the Brighton Trapping Project, where you could add value to an existing forest simply by removing herbivores, which increases the carbon that's stored in the existing forest. I'm going to scoot through these because Annie's staring at me. And Tiaki Maniatoto, which, is anyone here from the Maniatoto? Yes. Which is a fabulous catchment level project that I'm sure Tony could tell you a lot more about. And one of the things about the Tiaki Maniatoto project is that they're able to put together so much data because there's been a PhD student attached to that project, Caitlin, who's supervising, and she's amazing. And so she produced all these maps, and that level of verification and data collection puts them in such a good position to then be able to go to a biodiversity market or something like that and verify that they're actually increasing biodiversity outcomes. So biodiversity can be carbon positive for soils. I've had a couple of students looking at carbon in soils on regenerative pastoral lands. Willow was working on Mark Anderson's dairy farm down in Waiwera South, where there was a higher carbon at depth under diverse pastures compared to conventional pastures. Jessica Zubin was working on Royal Burn and Lake Hawea stations, much more variable types of landforms, but she still found a correlation between pasture species richness and carbon sequestration, probably because you get these different life forms and rooting depths. And biodiversity can limit fire risk. And this is some modelling that we did, again, based on vegetation change at Mahu Whenua, that when you look at the flammability of forest and shrubland communities, higher biodiversity, a more species-rich understory, more herbaceous species actually reduces the overall fire risk and change fire behaviour. So it actually all comes full circle that protecting the investment in the carbon can also be biodiversity positive, which can put you in a position to, you know, when there is a carbon, you know, a biodiversity credit scheme in New Zealand, if you've got your documentation, you can then be in a position to sell credits. I will skip that one. I'll just go to the last slide. So how can farmers benefit from carbon and biodiversity positive actions? I really encourage in the process of fencing off riparian areas, which is part of all of the freshwater plans, monitor your carbon in your soils. Because if you've got that before and after data, you are then in a really, really good position to say, as part of the emissions plans for farms, there, look, I've increased my soil carbon storage by X amount of tons. Think about managing under exotic canopies for native biodiversity. And then that puts you in a position to potentially transition. The idea of cutting out the exotic trees, managing for the longer lived native trees, and the value of being part of a catchment group, the economies of scale, access to funding, knowledge sharing, hosting a student and documenting, verifying with photo points and iNaturalist. These all seem to be the things that you're building up that body of proof that will stand you in very good stead once, you know, the policy environment settles down a bit and we know where we're tracking in terms of farm emissions reporting. Right, that's all. Thank you very much.